We are here welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou, faculty member at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and the director of the Initiative on Religion, Law and Diplomacy. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi, Christiana. It's great to be talking to you.
Thank you so much for making time to speak with the American Hellenic Council and our members and educate us a little bit more on issues revolving diplomacy, law, religious freedom, and a lot of the topics that are very relevant to Hellenic advocacy.
Thank you, and congratulations on the work that the American Hellenic Council has done and continues to do. I really appreciate your efforts to educate, inform, and develop activists who can make a difference when it comes to peace in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Thank you. Thank you. So today's a special day, May 29th. I know that it's a day that involves a topic that you have discussed a lot through both your scholarly work and your policy work. It is the anniversary of the Fall of Constantinople in 1453. So let's see, how does this date relate to what's going on today? Why is it a modern issue as well?
Well, I appreciate your opening with that. And although we've tried to ourselves to establish a date for our conversation, I think there's a kind of, auspicious convergence that we decided on today, May 29th. There's a lot that's happening in Turkey today, in fact, on this date. You mentioned that this is the anniversary of the Fall of Constantinople, the capture of the so-called Queen of Cities at the time by the Ottoman Turkish armies. And today in Turkey, there are enormous celebrations going on to commemorate that date, the date that under the rubric that's used over and over and over again across the political spectrum, the date of conquest. Today is also the day that all restrictions have been first lifted. It's the first day of lifting all the restrictions on worshiping in mosques in Turkey under the COVID-19 restrictions and regime. So the call for worshiping to re-inaugurate the end of the COVID-19 limitations has converged with the commemoration of the Fall of Constantinople. And as I mentioned, both President Erdogan and members of his party and also the Nationalist Action Party in Turkey and others have called for today to be a celebration of the conquest of the city and the grandeur and glory of the Ottoman Empire and its inheritance, the Republic of Turkey today.
That is a symbolic decision from the Turkish government, and it seems to follow a number of symbolic and practical actions that have led up through 2020.
Yeah, I think, again, I think why today is so important and the convergence of the commemoration of the Fall of Constantinople and the reopening of public prayer in mosques, collective prayer in mosques, and the connection between the Ottoman Empire and the modern Turkish state, the Republic of Turkey as the inheritor of that, is that it expresses what we've been seeing in Turkey, certainly since the election of the AKP government in 2002, but far more, compellingly and fully over the last 3 to 5 years under AKP. And that's namely a vision of Turkey as a Neo-Ottoman regional hegemon and global power. And so the symbolism and the semiotics of worship in mosques, but also in front of Hagia Sophia, the call first to worship inside Hagia Sophia with Islamic prayers. The Erdogan government has stepped back slightly from that, but they're, at least until now, where they're 7 hours ahead and watching the news and reading the news, until now there have been no prayers inside, and the president has called for prayers in the large open space between Hagia Sophia and the Blue Mosque, and also commemorative reenactments of the conquest of the city in that same space. That again converges with this larger vision of the Erdogan government for Turkey to be a kind of Neo-Ottoman imperial power, not simply a nation state with its own territorial boundaries, but an imperial power, and one that seeks to have enormous leverage over and engagement in the former territorial spaces of the Ottoman Empire, including parts of North Africa, parts of Europe, and also the Middle East.
Yes, it seems, looking at the Turkish government today and watching closely as from the February weaponization of refugees at the Evros border to the incessant increase in flyovers and airspace violation, water violations in the Aegean, as well as the rhetoric being used about demilitarizing Greek islands of Chios and the Dodecanese that are bordering essentially the Turkish state. It seems like Turkey has been making decisions suggesting a turn in its behavior. What can we make of these recent decisions, these actions?
So you've identified, you know, several developments really that are several developments in the last couple of years in Turkey, but there's a broader pattern at work here. And again, you know, the conjunctural moment is the election of the Erdogan government in November 2002, but there's deeper historical footprint here. So I think what we're beginning to see now in Turkey is the fullest expression of a neo-imperial power, as I mentioned before, which means destabilization on 3 continents, in Asia, in Europe, and in Africa. Turkey's ambitions to be a hegemon on those 3 continents, but also that, you know, kind of neo-imperial turn has been matched by a very marked shift away from Turkey's kind of hybridized democratic regime with, you know, features of authoritarianism to full-blown authoritarianism, maybe even totalitarianism. And I thought it would be useful for us to, you know, take note of the fact that Germany's Bertelsmann Stiftung Foundation, they recently issued a report on governance and democracy in European and Asian countries and Eurasian countries, and they indicated they called Turkey a de facto dictatorship today. Similarly, the Carnegie Middle East Center has talked about Turkey as having all the trappings of a full autocracy. So we're seeing this kind of domestic, external, or domestic policy, foreign policy convergence with authoritarianism, autocracy domestically, and a move towards what we would call in international relations rogue state behaviors externally, behaviors that indicate a lack of respect for foundational principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity of neighbors. So I think that's what we've been seeing over the last 2 years. We've certainly seen it as a more gradual, incremental trend since 2002. But I would submit for all of us in terms of analyzing how Turkey got to its current point and in terms of implications for the region, that these are patterns that we've seen, you know, under so-called Kemalist secularist governments as well, and really since Turkey became a member of NATO in 1953. So what we're seeing now is are patterns that are thrown into very sharp relief, but they are deep patterns over the longer historical durée that speak to certain perspectives by Turkish state makers and foreign policy makers about questions of sovereignty and respect for international law, democracy, civil and political liberties, and human rights.
So you touched on a couple of things. First of all, NATO and the relationship between NATO members, in which the United States plays a very big role, of course, as a leader of the West and of the supranational organization. You also use the term rogue, which I understand as a rogue state, it has very specific implications. We sometimes throw around words without having a purpose, but I think in this specific case, this lexicon use is very specific. And as someone, you have served for 4 different terms or 4 consecutive terms rather, at the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom, as well as the State Department, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, the State Department's Religion and Freedom policy working group. So you have extensive knowledge from a policy perspective and extensive knowledge from a scholarly perspective. So how do you use the word rogue, and how do you see the fact that there's other people using the word rogue state to define Turkey? What does this mean?
Well, when scholars use the term rogue state, but also when policymakers do, we're basically talking about a state that doesn't respect the foundational operating and organizing principles of the international order. How do we keep order in the world today? The world's organized according to states, and states have territorial boundaries and borders. And so the fundamental principle of sovereignty that organizes the world in which we live is that states don't interfere in the domestic affairs of others. Now, we know that's an ideal type, but nonetheless, that's the organizing structure. And that's certainly the principle that members of NATO subscribe to, both as a collective security alliance and also NATO as a shared member states who are a shared community of values. And those are the values of democracy, rule of law, and respect for human rights. And so Turkey's lack of regard and demonstrated lack of respect, both vis-a-vis its own citizenry, but also vis-a-vis countries in the neighborhood, everywhere from, you know, Iraq to Syria to Cyprus, you know, the kind of saber rattling now vis-a-vis Greece and what's happening on the Evros border suggests that Turkey does not respect those foundational organizing principles, and it certainly doesn't comply with and reflect the notion of NATO as a shared community of values. So what we're seeing in Turkey now, I think, you know, raises very serious questions, and the notion of a rogue state, serious questions about the cohesiveness and the capacity of NATO to carry out its own mission and to protect the interests of its own alliance members.
So how do we rectify the two? How do we rectify that what most U.S. policy, State Department officials and diplomats and scholars define one of the largest members of NATO as a rogue state? How do we rectify these two? And what is your take on that as someone who's worked with a lot of members of both organizations?
Well, so I served, as you mentioned, yeah, as you mentioned, I served on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and then I was not part of the State Department. I simply was a member of the advisory working group of Secretaries Clinton and Kerry on religion and U.S. foreign policy. But I did serve as a U.S. diplomat on the USIRF, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And one of the things that's become clear through, you know, decades of work on religion and geopolitics is that there is a linkage between democracy, religious freedom, and human rights on the one hand, and security, both state security and non-traditional forms of security on the other. And I think, again, it's useful for us to look at some concrete examples that help to explain why some people are beginning to use this term rogue state for Turkey. And I think it's a designation that actually, based on the empirical evidence, stands, and then leads to your query of, okay, so what's to be done? Just in the last 12 months, let's think about, or in the last 2 years even, let's think about Turkey's twice invasion of northern Syria. First in the Operation Olive Branch. These are the names of these military incursions. Operation Olive Branch in March 2018 into Afrin, and then more recently in October 2019, so-called Operation Peace Spring. In both cases, we now see Turkish troops on the ground, and also Turkish supported mercenaries active in northern Syria. And Turkey's been very clear that it's unwilling to withdraw from northern Syria because it wants to establish a permanent zone of interest on that border space. We've also seen, for example, Turkey purchasing, installing, and about to activate S-400, the Russian-produced S-400 missile defense system, which certainly is a violation of its NATO obligations. Turkey has tested that missile defense system. President Erdogan rejected President Trump's request when Erdogan did a head of state visit to the U.S. in November 2019 to refrain from activating those missiles. And in fact, he's most recently said there's no going back on activation. That may produce a whole host of results, and we can talk about that. But this missile system is incompatible with NATO, and also because it's an air defense system, it can be used by Turkey against states that it deems hostile to Turkey, as well as against its fellow member states inside NATO. Then we see more recently Turkey signing 2 agreements with Libya. The first agreement, a memorandum, was about boosting military and security cooperation. And so we've seen, Turkey sending mercenaries from Syria and Iraq, former ISIS-affiliated mercenaries into Libya to support the Libyan government, along with Qatar. So there's a kind of Islamist, flavor or orientation in that alliance there. And then secondly, an agreement between Turkey and Libya about the delineation of maritime boundaries in the Mediterranean. And that second one in particular, that second memorandum is particularly concerning for NATO and the EU, because what that memorandum does is it reflects Turkey's view that the entire Mediterranean is a Turkish lake. It takes issue with Greece, Cyprus, the Republic of Cyprus, and Israel and Egypt's maritime boundaries. It calls those into question, coming back to this issue of rogue states disregarding sovereignty. And it also leads to the possibility of a hot conflict this coming summer, because Turkey has declared that it's going to begin energy exploration in the territorial waters of Greece, south of Crete, which Turkey now considers to be open territorial maritime space that's actually Turkish maritime space. So all of these are simple examples of a series of behaviors which speak to Turkey as, at best, a disruptor within NATO, and at worst, a potential malign actor and hostile actor vis-a-vis its NATO member states. Which leads to questions about what should be done. But I think it's important just to offer even a short menu of some of these developments, because they speak to the sharp divergence between, Turkey's commitments inside NATO and its respect for international law and rule of law.
So I know that when we speak of Hellenic advocacy, so many, even those of us who've been involved for many years, many more years than myself, it's always a Greece and Cyprus issue. And for the American Hellenic Council was actually founded in 1974 as the Save Cyprus Council because of the invasion, the illegal invasion in Cyprus. But have we finally reached a point where the global community can start looking at Turkey as not just a Hellenic issue, but rather an everybody issue? Have we reached that point where we are now, when ignoring or just overlooking certain behaviors, reaching a point of appeasement that's reminiscent to World War II situation?
I think that's a critical question. I mean, certainly not for the American Hellenic Council and the work that you're doing, the fine work you're doing, but also more generally for American foreign and security experts. And I think it's a category mistake. It's an analytic mistake to look at these kinds of actions by Turkey. And again, I would emphasize that these are not new. These are not, simply actions undertaken by the Erdogan, Islamist government, but these are actions that, speak to the broader pattern practiced by Kemalist secularist governments. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind, because it speaks to whether or not the responses to these kinds of actions have actually enabled Turkey and allowed it to get to this point, okay, and created a kind of brittleness in the relationship between Turkey and its other fellow NATO member states. So that's a long-winded way of saying that what may appear to be Hellenic issues, in quotation marks, issues that are, more specifically linked to Greece, the interests of Greece and Cyprus, are not. Simply those, Greece and Cyprus and Turkey, that triangular relationship is a microcosm and if you're a student or an academic, a fantastic kind of laboratory for analyzing a broader set of strategic questions, and security and strategic, as well as democracy and human rights questions that are of central importance to the United States, to the NATO alliance, and more generally to peace and stability, as I said, on 3 continents, in Europe, in Asia, and in Africa. So to present these, or to deliberately, for some, only limit them or misunderstand them as Hellenic issues is to miss the point. These are, Greece and Cyprus happen to be the two countries that are, at the center of Turkey's bullseye. But if you're Iraq or if you're Syria, the same holds true. The Turkish Foreign Ministry several years ago published new maps of Turkish territory, and they included all of Greek Thrace, all of the Aegean Islands, and they also included big portions of Iraqi territory up to Mosul. If you're Syria today and you see Turkish troops, on Syrian territory, regardless of what one may think of the Syrian regime and its brutality and its war crimes and all of the things that we see on the ground, the fact of the matter is that is still Syrian territory. So if you're Syria and you see Turkish troops and/or Turkish supported mercenaries hunkered down on Syrian territory, again, you realize that Turkey's behaviors aren't simply limited to Greece and the Republic of Cyprus. And you mentioned the invasion of Cyprus. Again, 1974, we are 46 years out and counting, in terms of an occupation of a now EU member state, and an occupation where the practices of religious and ethnic cleansing and the systematic gross violations of religious freedom that accompany those in the occupied territories are the kinds of things that we've seen associated with ISIS practices. And yet those have been perpetrated by a NATO member state and an EU candidate country with little consequence. And that gets to this issue of sort of what are the useful responses, prudent responses? How do you enable actors within Turkey who oppose these kinds of foreign and domestic policies? And what sort of compliance and teeth do you use, or sticks rather than simply carrots, in order to help reverse or alter this pattern, this long multi-decades pattern of behavior?
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like you touched on many points, but two of them that are directly affected in the core principles of the current U.S. geopolitical interest, which is security and energy. As we all were within the Hellenic community, excited to see the Eastern Mediterranean Agreement in December signed into law, as well as the trilateral agreement between Cyprus, Israel and Greece, and Italy and Lebanon signed on afterwards, about energy exploration and gas exportation. How does this behavior by the Turkish state and the prevalence of this Neo-Ottoman imperialism, as you call it, affect our U.S. geopolitical interests?
Well, I think, and I've been looking here at my notes because I didn't want to, overlook some specific points. So, what we have seen is an appreciation in the Eastern Mediterranean of the importance of cooperation to produce, some people talked about a kind of energy peace dividend, okay? If it were possible to develop cooperative relationships with the key powers in the Eastern Mediterranean space when it came to energy exploration, extraction, and use. And instead of seeing that, what we've seen is a kind of fragmentation. So on the one hand, we see cooperative relationships having been developed between Greece, the Republic of Cyprus, Israel, and Egypt. On the other hand, we've seen Turkey push back against that kind of cooperation for a lot of reasons, again, and I would cite two. Number one, Turkey is energy dependent. It imports most of its energy resources, primarily from Iran and Russia, which also helps us understand the kind of, I would say, diplomatic marriage of convenience that's been emerging between Russia and Turkey. So energy dependence means that Turkey wants to have, monopoly control over the already discovered and potentially discovered, potential for discovery, energy resources in the Eastern Med, number one. Number two is, again, the sovereignty issue. Turkey views the Mediterranean basically as a Turkish lake. And they see the Mediterranean as part of a kind of larger geopolitical maritime strategy that they call Mavi Vatan, the blue seas geopolitical strategy. And the blue seas over which Turkey wants to exercise monopoly control are three. One is the Black Sea, one is the Aegean Sea, and the other is the Mediterranean Sea. And this three seas geopolitical perspective, okay, helps us to understand how it is that Turkey understands its own energy interests in the Eastern Med in ways that are very contradictory to the kind of regional cooperation and potential for peace building and economic development that I mentioned earlier, and also in terms of its NATO relationship. So it sees Greece, for example, a NATO member state, as at best a competitor, and at worst as an impediment to Turkey's own aims of monopoly control of the Mediterranean Sea when it comes to energy, amongst other things. Mm-hmm. But this three seas perspective, I think, is really important because it speaks to Turkey's geostrategic perspective, its goal of becoming a tri-continental hegemon, at the point of intersection between Europe, Asia, and Africa in the energy zone of the Eastern Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So we've also seen, sorry, it feels very, this information is so starkly ominous. And as Greeks and Cypriots, we have memories, but also are currently living through situations that makes one more fearful about what tomorrow looks like. And we see a Turkey that in the past 6 months has also been affected by a pandemic. And we've seen the Turkish lira dropping exponentially and the economy suffering. And in the past, if history is to teach us anything, rogue states or states with tendencies towards being rogue take moments of such weakness and somehow revitalize in a much more aggressive way. So George Yorgos, who's a professor at the University of Athens, a geopolitics professor, the other day in an interview said that he predicts the summer will have highly aggressive behavior from Turkey towards Greece as a response to this weakness that COVID and their economy has shown. How do you agree with that statement? Do you think that's something that is a safe prediction?
I do. I mean, I think as a general rule, when we look at authoritarian states in particular, but unfortunately there's evidence this holds true for democratic states as well. But when we see authoritarian states facing growing domestic discontent and opposition pressures, oftentimes the response is to play the nationalist card. And playing the nationalist card means foreign policy adventurism. And there are those who argue, and I concur with this assessment, that one of the reasons, a miscalculation in hindsight for Erdogan, but one of the reasons that he decided to move into northern Syria was to try to deflect attention away from the rapid deterioration, the accelerated deterioration in the Turkish economy. And that'll, parenthesis, that brings us back to one of the causes for that, which has to do with how the US responded to religious freedom violations in Turkey. But so foreign policy adventurism, if we look at, again, the long trajectory of the Turkish Republic, has often been the consequence of domestic unrest or strains created by authoritarianism inside Turkey. And the most common target of that, foreign policy adventurism, kind of playing the nationalist card, has been unfortunately Greece and or Cyprus. And I think given what we're already seeing in terms of incremental testing by the Ankara government over the last several months, there's every reason to be gravely concerned about the possibility of a hot incident, either along the Evros border between Greece and Turkey or in the Mediterranean. And I mentioned some examples. I mentioned earlier Turkey's declared intention to begin exploration, natural gas exploration off the southern coast of Crete. I mean, that will be a direct violation of Greece's territorial waters, its maritime boundaries. What will be the response to that? The other thing, currently, there's a Turkish police unit which is encamped on Greek territory at the Evros border. The Evros River, the riverbed, the river course and bed changes according to natural waterfall. And so as the Greek government has moved to expand the fencing and the protective border between Greece and Turkey at that site, running parallel with the river. Why has it done that? Because Turkey weaponized refugees and migrants, as you mentioned earlier this year, busing enormous amounts of people to the Greek border and having declared that they would send them across the border into Europe. The Greek government has now moved to expand the protective fencing on the border. Well, the Turkish government claims that that border is in dispute because of the riverbed formation. There's never, ever historically been a dispute over that border, but there are Turkish police now which are on Greek territory, which legally and technically already constitutes a violation of Greece's territorial integrity. The Greek government has tried to de-escalate or prevent any escalation in this, and is, engaged in an open diplomatic conversation with Ankara about this. But it would be very easy for that space to expand and lead to an escalation and very easily a potential conflict. And the one thing we oftentimes forget is we think that conflicts, that kind of adventurism is always systematic and deliberate. It may be intentional, but what many times happens in the international arena is that conflicts are the result of very bad accidents. And given the brittleness of Turkey's relationship with Greece in these spaces, the parameters for avoiding an accident are very, very small. And the inclination of the Erdogan government to try to address the tanking of the economy and the blowback from the mismanagement of COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, there would be to play the nationalist card. And Greece will be the target of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's look a little bit, because in the case of an accident, of such an accident, and in the case of an escalation to a conflict, there will presumably be a response from many other states beyond the Greek state, whether that's from Europe or from the US. But let's look a little bit at the US, from the US perspective. When you served in the Commission for Religious Freedoms, you served under, it was both under George 43 and the Obama administration, if I'm not mistaken. What would you say the Trump administration has done that indicates a general perspective towards Turkey, or Secretary Pompeo has always been expressed hopefulness that Turkey will not escalate things without actually taking any actions. So what is your take on the US approach today?
Well, in terms of this intersection of religious freedom and human rights on one hand and security on the other, a couple of points are useful to sort of recollect. I served from 2004 to 2012 on the USERF, and I was Speaker Pelosi's appointee to the USERF, and served under both President George W. Bush's administration and President Barack Obama's administration. The Commission is a bipartisan U.S. government agency. We made two trips to Turkey, fact-finding trips to Turkey when I served. The second trip included a trip to Turkish-occupied Cyprus. We went to Cyprus and went into the occupied zone on a fact-finding mission as well. And the culmination of the first trip and the second trip was, after the first trip, the Commission designated Turkey a watch list country. Its current designation under the Commission today, which means it's a country where religious freedom violations don't rise to the level of a country of particular concern, namely a country that perpetrates systematic, egregious violations of religious freedom, but where there are signs, where there's empirical evidence of a pattern of violations that deserves, following. After the second trip, the Commission in 2012 voted to designate Turkey a country of particular concern, a CPC, along with other systematic egregious violators like China, like Saudi Arabia, like North Korea. And Currently, the Commission has designated Turkey a watch list country, again, presumably for some improvements, and I think those are fictitious based on empirical evidence, but that's another conversation we may have. So both the administration of President Bush, the administration of President Obama, and now the administration of President Trump certainly recognize that there are religious freedom problems in Turkey. One of the things that the Trump administration did was to impose sanctions ultimately on Turkey, economic sanctions related to Turkey's almost 2-year detention of Protestant pastor Andrew Brunson. He was detained under charges by the Turkish government of being a collaborator with the Fethullah Gulen organization, which Turkey has designated since 2016 as a terrorist organization, the Fethullah terrorist organization. So Andrew Brunson was detained without evidence almost 2 years, and after repeated diplomatic requests by the US government for his release, he is a US citizen, the Trump administration imposed economic sanctions on Turkey. And those economic sanctions produced very serious economic consequences. The Turkish lira fell by, I think it was 20 to 25% within the space of 1 week. And they produced a change in Turkey's behavior because Turkey then released Pastor Andrew Brunson. And I emphasize this point because it gets back to what is to be done. In the case of Turkey's foreign and domestic policy, challenges and violations of its international and alliance legal commitments, we have a case here in that of Andrew Brunson that shows that a judicious mix of incentives but also compliance measures can produce positive changes. Unfortunately, once Pastor Brunson was released, the Trump administration lifted those economic sanctions. And I say unfortunately because Turkey's violations of religious freedom vis-a-vis its indigenous Christian communities, Greek, Armenian, and Syriac, as well as Roman Catholic and Protestant communities, against the Jewish community increasingly and the Alawite community. Those are long-standing. They have put, in particular, the first 3 communities at risk of survival. And so the lifting of those sanctions in some ways suggests it's okay for you to go back to business as usual. But that's an example of how the use of sanctions, at least the targeted use of a sanctions mechanism, can produce behavioral changes. And one of the things that people are discussing in Congress when it comes to sanctions is the question of the S-400s. And there is quite strong bipartisan support in Congress for the use of the CAATSA sanction, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. CAATSA is the acronym for that. And that would impose sanctions blocking a whole host of financial transactions between Turkey and the United States. It would deny visas to Turkish officials seeking to come to the United States because of Turkey's purchase of and activation of the S-400s. Now, until the present moment, the White House has not been supportive of the application of CAATSA sanctions, but there are those who hypothesize that the White House may be beginning to see things differently. And that the consequence, the goal of the sanctions would be to send both a symbol, but also to produce a behavioral change on the part of Turkey, not to ostracize Turkey, but to change a pattern of behavior that is certainly disruptive and a threat to the stability of the Eastern Med, but also to US foreign and strategic interests in Eurasia. So in terms of the what is to be done, there's a whole toolbox of mechanisms that can be utilized that, move away from what you described, a kind of de facto appeasement for these kinds of violations.
Well, I know that we're almost at our time limit, but did you have any final thoughts on the current state, on perhaps even how COVID has affected everything that's going on right now in the Eastern Mediterranean?
Well, for one thing, I take my hat off to the Greek government for its very effective management of the COVID-19 pandemic under, the worst of circumstances. A decade of economic depression in Greece, and collective suffering that was associated with that economic depression, and also facing direct and indirect threats to its sovereignty from Turkey in the form of the weaponization of migrants and the other things we discussed. So the Greek government has demonstrated a kind of foresightedness. It's been able to marshal an inter-party, bipartisan, multi-partisan consensus on the need to address COVID-19 in the way it has, and also to the Greek public, which has shown a kind of conscience and awareness of something that seems to be disappearing worldwide, which is the notion of the collective good, and a recognition that individual sacrifices on behalf of the collectivity are ones that are worth making, and that they can, sustain the overall, the health, literal and figurative, of the overall country. So I take my hat off to Greece, and I wish Greece well in terms of, ongoing management of the pandemic. And then I also, think it's very, in closing, very, very important for us to take seriously the possibility of a hot incident in the Eastern Med, and for NATO member states not to consider Turkey's malign behavior as a disagreement amongst friends. Friends do not target each other with, with weapons. Friends do not, develop maps that show their neighbor's territory to be part of their own. And friends do not begin incrementally occupying neighbors' territory. So I think it would be a very serious mistake to think about Turkey's behavior as something that will pass and as simply a disagreement among friends. Excuse me. The reality of our virtual life, Zooming.
Yeah.
So I think that taking firm but low-key measures that let Turkey know that there will be consequences to that behavior will be optimal for NATO's interests, for the US's interests certainly, and ultimately for those actors inside Turkey who face the constraints of authoritarianism at home and do not support adventurism abroad. I mean, it's a signal not only to Turkey vis-a-vis its alliance partners, but also to those actors inside Turkey who are looking for support for rule of law and for respect for human rights and civil and political liberties. So it would be a win-win in that regard to change the way that the discourse and the practices vis-a-vis Turkey's rogue state behaviors are playing out.
Yes, well, I want to take a moment to thank you for sharing your insights, your knowledge, and for everything you do in support of religious freedom throughout the world, and for teaching the next generation of students on how to best advocate for freedom. And
thank you very much, and thank you for the work that you're all doing. I mean, it's absolutely important, and I think the connection between education, information, and activism, and thoughtful activism is so important. And so I appreciate your working as a kind of think and do organization. It's been great talking to you, and thank you for Zooming together in our new virtual world. And hopefully we'll all be in some way, shape, or form able to have live interpersonal relations.
Soon, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Elizabeth.